Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another candid conversation with your CPA. Today, I have Andrew Livingston with me, Director of Economics and Research with Vicente LLP law firm. Andrew's been in the industry for a number of years. I feel like he's a wealth of information on both the economic side and the legal side and licensing side. And coming from Colorado, he's just got an interesting ground zero look at everything. So, Andrew, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Thank you so much, Ray. Really good to join the podcast. Yeah, so I've been in the cannabis space since about 2012. A little bit before then, but that was mostly in college. So I helped to pass Amendment 64 back in 2012 in Colorado, and I've been working with the people that helped to pass that. Formerly Vicente Cedarburg, now Vicente Law Firm. Over the last 12 years, helping cannabis clients in the United States, a little bit internationally, navigate and understand what kind of cannabis markets look like, how the regulatory requirements in each state change the market structure and infrastructure, and helping people plan for the future.
Nice, nice. No, that makes sense kind of because there's different areas to, look at the need for economics and how we can view the data and everything. So let's just start with the licensees side. Obviously, you're with Vicente, they're on the legal side. I always joke when starting a cannabis business, you kind of need a lawyer, a real estate agent, and a finance dude. You need money, you need a license, you need a place to put the business. So
Yeah,
you guys helped with the licenses and definitely starting out, it was kind of like a really big unknown. And so, can you talk just a little bit about your process going from early day licensing and to where we are nowadays with the licensing process?
absolutely. So, it's still the things you need are still the most important things you needed then and the things you need now, which are a good team, property, and money. Now, in some of the states, they're allowing you to apply without property and things like that, or you need far less money. But there's still kind of those three core elements. So
Hmm.
let's actually break it down all the way to the beginning. So first medical cannabis law passed in California in 1995. Um, Now, from about 1995 to about 2008, with Michigan passing its medical cannabis law, all the medical cannabis laws that were passed during that period of time, by and large, save for New Mexico, were patient caregiver non-commercial laws, right? So you didn't have licenses, right? Maybe you had a caregiver license or a patient registration, but these were essentially implicitly, or in some cases, Washington, as well as Alaska, explicitly non-commercial medical cannabis programs, right? So you didn't have real licensing
Hmm.
until New Mexico was the first passed in 2007 with a nonprofit system. But Colorado was really the first major one in 2010 to pass through their legislature a law which created a licensing system for a for-profit licensing system for medical cannabis businesses, right? So this is where we exited the Bush era into the Obama era. Obama put out the first Ogden memorandum in 2009 that pretty much said we're not going to go after patients and caregivers, right? So a lot of people said, "Sweet, I'm going to open up a cannabis store," right?
Right.
And this is kind of, I would say, the initial aspect of cannabis licensing. So in many of those states during the initial run at this, um, licensing was just finding property, applying with whether it's the State Department of Health or the State Department of Revenue, obtaining that cannabis license, becoming opening up your store, getting all your local permits and everything like that, and then opening and getting ready, right? Um, and this is kind of why we have in some states like so many licenses. So in places like
Yeah.
Colorado, in places like California. Like, California actually licensed its medical program only in about 2015 with Mercusa, Oregon, and a few others, right? You have these lots of different licenses. Um, what we saw though during that period of time, from probably about 2010 to probably about 2000 and depends, 2013 maybe. Um, there was kind of these more open systems where these patient caregiver laws had, acted previously, and then, kind of through that transition, we saw licensing. Then we saw an interesting thing. So all of those states that passed whether it's Oregon or Colorado or others, those were all more so Western states, but also it passed through ballot initiative, the initial medical cannabis program. So there's less restrictions. Then we started to see medical cannabis laws being passed on the East Coast. So in New York, New Jersey, um, Rhode Island. Well, Rhode Island was a little bit earlier than that, and a few others. And a lot of these programs, they didn't have initial kind of patient caregiver laws. They were just licensing from the start. And they were reacting to some of what was happening and the news that was happening, over 10 years ago, um, in Southern California and in San Francisco and to some degree Colorado, where there was a lot of cannabis stores that were opening quickly. And so they were
Hmm.
more interested in control. So this was the era of medical cannabis during that period of time. And they wanted to erect these systems where they were tightly controlled, there was a limited number of licenses, and there was kind of in-depth vetting process, big applications, so that the regulators could score them and make sure that they had the best cannabis businesses, right? They didn't want a lot of businesses starting up and then failing, and then they wanted a tightly controlled system. I think that
Yep.
New York and New Jersey with medical cannabis were good examples of this. And so this created an era that lasted about 6 to 8 years or so, depending on how you want to count it, where you saw a lot of these competitive licensing systems. They issued a handful, maybe a few dozen at the most, in some cases just less than a single handful of
Okay.
cannabis licenses, and everyone worked to put in these big applications and win a lot of them. And that's kind of really where a lot of the work that Vicente had LLP had done from about 2014, and we still do licensing now, but the licensing systems have changed a little bit, and I'll talk about that. So
Yeah.
with all of that sort of stuff, right? You needed a big team, you need a lot of money, you need a detailed market analysis, pro forma, all this business plans, and assemble essentially hundreds of pages of documents. So you really need project managers. So that was kind of how licensing occurred during that period of time. But then, one of the things that we had seen over the last few years was that, people were frustrated as we were transitioning to adult use that a lot of these operators that occurred under medical, whether or not it was places like Ohio or Pennsylvania or New York or New Jersey or Delaware or Maryland, were predominantly wealthy, in most cases, white existing business entrepreneurs. And that's because, well, of course, when you have a scored application process that heavily weights the amount of capital that you can show on an application and your sophistication, you're going to get people who are rich and well connected. Um,
Hmm.
but that didn't look very good as
Yeah.
the states were looking to try to create a more diverse industry, right? And so the zeitgeist in America, as it
Yeah.
pertained to
Huh.
social equity, minority rights, increasing diversity, DEI programs, right? All of that cast a similar light onto the cannabis market and onto cannabis regulations that occurred during those
Yeah.
times.
Rightfully so.
Rightfully so, right? So in some cases you had, okay, now we're going to have a separate application process for social equity applicants, or we're going to reserve our application for social equity applicants, but we're still going to do scored and we're going to do all these sort of things. So Illinois is a good example of that, right? Well, they kind of had a lottery, but it was really for social equity. If you look at another state, in Massachusetts, they didn't have a limit on the number of licenses, but there were certain advantages to being social equity, all these sorts of things, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Everybody had their own flavor of it.
Everyone
Um,
has, yeah, there's a lots of micro experiments amongst the laboratories of democracy.
yeah.
So
Yeah.
with that, one of the interesting things that we saw is that after a while, right, there was all of these lawsuits because anyone who didn't win one of these competitive applications would sue.
Hmm.
And then invariably there were issues with the scoring, right? Like we're human. Sometimes the scoring was just really bad or partially corrupt. In other cases, there was just mistakes that were made.
Yeah.
So states flipped to lottery systems. I think probably the first one here was maybe the first, but we look at Illinois, which is a significant lottery system. But now also, whether it's Delaware or Minnesota, Maryland, Connecticut, a lot of these sorts of places. So they switched to lottery systems because they thought, well, that's more fair for a social equity applicant who is lower income. and hopefully we'll get less lawsuits, right? So we switch from these big, robust applications with hundreds and hundreds of pages because we were interested in making sure that the businesses that came about were, secure, well-financed, and, stacked with a team of, decades of business experience to a licensing system that was more so designed for how can we transition, not even transition, how can we ensure that minority
Or bring
business
in.
entrepreneurs are able to participate, right? Most of these systems don't actually want to really encourage black market transition. It's save for Oregon and Vermont. Most of them are instead still looking at, they want a more diverse business ownership. And maybe New York to a certain extent you could put there too, but if you really want to attract existing businesses in who are on the illicit side, you just don't have a robust application process, right? So still,
Yeah.
if you look at a place like Maryland, like they want a more diversely held industry, but whether or not those people had prior cannabis experience in the illicit market isn't as much of a priority as just ensuring that, we don't just have an entirely white-owned industry, right? So that's kind of how it's a both long and short synopsis of
No,
the
no, it's
era of
detailed.
time
It's
and
good.
how it changed. All that's very important, right? If you are a cannabis business and you were looking to apply in a new state, you have to understand why a state set up the system it did, right? In order to do well, you have to know why, right? Because knowing why is going to allow you to anticipate the moves a state may make or how it will react to certain business structures, right? And you have to look at this. It's like a lot of it is like reading through the lines because the politics affects the policy, and the policy affects the licensing structure. So all of this
Yep.
flows downstream from the political desires of the state, the policymakers who put the law into place, and to a lesser degree, the regulators. But the regulators really political desires are based upon what the governor is usually wanting, or the head of the whatever department or administration it's in.
Okay. Man, thank you so much for just kind of the detailed history.
Yeah.
And then for sure, anybody who's been like really deeply following along it, everything you explained makes a lot of sense. Where, like, kind of most things, it's like most people have good intentions for sure. And so when they solve one problem in the future or downstream, they somehow create like an unintended or different problem. It's kind of slightly comical if you think back,
Yeah.
at least from that
Yeah.
perspective, because everybody
Like
had good intentions.
everyone does, all these states do lotteries now. And now they're dealing with the issue, well, a cannabis business will just apply dozens of times,
Hmm.
right? Like it's very hard to create a system that well-resourced, wealthy individuals do not have an advantage,
Yeah, or game in some form or
right?
fashion.
You know, all all activities require resources,
Yes.
right? Whether
Whether
that's
it's time
applying
or
for a new
focus.
state or, applying or even starting up the businesses or marketing or all that stuff. People with more resources will do better, right?
Hmm.
And so that's a difficult thing. And
Yep.
and in my mind, the best way to scare away the well-heeled businesses are through systems that are highly competitive. Because that's the main thing people who have a lot of money don't want to deal with, which is a ton of competition.
Yeah, they don't like that game, especially a small business competition. They're like, I just want to be one with a few of them. And I guess that's a good transition into the economic side, which I know that's where me and you connected
Yeah.
originally. Like some of these businesses, like I know the pub codes get a lot of the headlines because of sheer volume of revenue. They have a pretty big share of it, but there's just by number of business owners and businesses out there and brands. Yeah, I see cannabis business as a small business, industry overall, but kind of just at a high level, tell us a little bit about how you transition into the economic side of what you're doing with Vicente, and just also like where do you see the average size of the American cannabis company in terms of revenues and employees, like the 80/20 rule? Like, are they less
Yeah.
than 20% or 20 million? Are they greater than 20 million? Where do you see them at?
So,
That was a
myself and
two-part question. I know I threw a lot
yeah,
at
yeah. So I'll go a little bit on the first one. So, or the second one. I and a handful of other economists in the cannabis space actually did a big research report on
Okay.
behalf of the Minority Cannabis Business Association for their rescheduling. So this is really fun. I worked on it. You guys, may know Bo Whitney. He also worked on it.
Mhm.
Another, great market analyst, Sammy Markland from FTI, my good friend Mark Gannett, from Rogue. We did this. It was really cool. It's part of kind of the rescheduling petition. And so what we wanted to
Nice.
pretty much show was the importance of understanding rescheduling as it pertained to minority business actors, right? This would have probably been more effective had Kamala Harris won, but alas, it's still important. And so one of
Still
the
important. Hey, you
interesting
still took the time to research it. The data lives on. I'm still
data
getting
lives
value
on.
from it. Go
Yeah.
on though.
So we surveyed and got about 206 response. I'm looking at this study right now.
Yeah,
We
yeah,
got
yeah.
two,
Please do.
200, over 200 responses, where about 171 were from businesses that directly, cultivated, processed, all that sort of stuff across 32 states and Puerto Rico. And here's what's fascinating is that, so the federal government has a definition of a small business, right? There's a small business administration. And what quantifies a small business is actually determined by NAICS codes. So that's a North American commercial. Let me see exactly what NAICS stands for. Um, and it's pretty much, right, let's see, it's North American Industry Classification System,
That's what I was
NAICS.
gonna say.
So the North
Okay.
American Industry Classification Systems are, it comes out from the Census Bureau, but pretty much they calculate, okay, what is a quote large business or a small business? And it depends. In most cases, it's either number of revenue or it's the number of employees or
Okay.
in some case, it's the volume, depending on which sector you're in. So there's not NAICS codes for cannabis because it's illegal. So we just used similar sort of things.
Yeah.
So like, for instance, an extractor, we use the same code as those who make like, peppermint oil or vanilla extract sort of thing. Or,
Makes
for
sense
a
to me.
grower, it's like floriculture. So people who, grow flowers or indoor greenhouse, floriculture type thing. So when we looked at all of that, of those that were surveyed, so over
Okay.
170 cannabis businesses, 82% of them would qualify as small businesses. If you look at retail, so this is just retail businesses, whether or not they have wholesale distribution or not, 94% would quantify as small
In
businesses.
retail? Huh. Yeah, I see what you did
94%.
there because, right, because it's like if it's a retail store, if they sold some other products out of there, it's still a retail store. They're selling cannabis products. You can kind of do that, at least that analysis for how the US government classifies. I mean, for sure the same with manufacturing. Like there's other, businesses that have machines with people that run them. Raw material comes in, the
Yeah,
direct labor turns that into a finished goods, and they have similar NAICS. So 80% of cultivation and product manufacturers are you would be considered a small business, then 94% retail, which is wild because a lot of people think retail, or at least I'll just speak for myself. It's like you think there's way more people who own like franchise retail stores or there's, large retail store presences. And I think it's because you see the retail store more often. So you just start to be like, oh, yeah, that must be everywhere. But
everywhere. Yeah.
there's a lot of small
But
retail companies, businesses out there then.
yeah, even someone who, let's say they own three stores, like that's still a small business,
Yeah. Yeah. I
right?
say,
Like just think about it like in terms of American capitalism, right? Like I would bet that 80 plus percentage of businesses we see a day to day are either small businesses or multi-billion dollar publicly traded conglomerates.
yeah. Yeah. There's not a lot of in between. I would
And it's like
agree.
not it's like almost some of the in between is just like the cannabis, like a multi-state operator who owns 12 stores across three states. Like that's probably not, a small business. Um, but it's also like, different markets are different, right? Like tons of small businesses in Michigan, right? Lots of small businesses
That's where
in,
I'm closest to. So that's what I always associate it with. It's like
yeah,
Michigan's kind of lawless, where it's just like you walk into a place, you're like, this is a retail store. This looks like some dude's house.
yeah.
No offense to them. Like I love those operators as
But
well.
I mean, if we want to talk about why, like, why is
Yeah,
Michigan that way? It's
let's get into it.
because they passed a patient caregiver law in 2008, and then had, kind of there was a little more explicitly non-commercial. There was a some lawsuits too, but except say, outside of Ann Arbor, they were a little bit more lawless. But we saw a lot of these kind of stores pop up between what was it 2008 and 2000 and I'm trying to think when the MMFLA was passed, the Medical Marijuana Facility Licensing Act. I think it was like 2016.
I was gonna say, I don't know off the top of my head, but it
2016,
was after a
2017.
while.
Sorry. I know Michigan law quite relatively well. So then they licensed them, during that period of time. And there were so many of these kind of, some fly-by-night operations that, they didn't want to limit those number of licenses. So that's kind of
Right.
why Michigan's system looks the way it is. And then, shortly after they passed adult use. Um, so yeah, I mean, but if you look at a state like that versus you look at a state like Illinois, a lot more of those are going to be big businesses just based on how they license their cannabis
Yeah.
businesses with medical and then how they transition those over. Illinois' initial cannabis businesses were a limited number of, well-heeled operators.
Yeah.
And based upon when those businesses started to come in, and where the capital markets at that time. That is why, maybe not a majority, but a large chunk of the operators that are publicly traded, the publicly traded MSOs, whether or not it's GTI or Curaleaf or Cresco or others, many of them had assets and built some of their brands in Illinois. And
That
that's kind
makes a
of
lot of
why
sense.
when that state occurred with medical, how its rules were with regards to publicly traded entities, the size of the market, and the limited number of cultivators and retails that occurred during their initial medical licensing phase.
Huh. No, it is interesting. Like it's not, yeah, I just always stopped at like, is it limited license or a cap license? Obviously, cap license going to be a little bit more well capitalized and well funded. But it's even like, well, you got to go further than that of like, how did they roll out their original medical program? And was there a caregiver one? Because I don't know, bad habits die hard and like whole cities and counties get into habits. And so, like, Michigan, even though they're, they legalized now, they're still just kind of just, I don't know, those interesting operators. One last question on just kind of the categories of small business versus
Yeah.
large. When you were looking at the US government and they broke it down, some with number of employees, some with dollar amounts, can you give us a range of what those dollar amounts and number of employees were for whether you were considered a small business, medium, large business? Really just small business.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm looking right now at the footnote on this. So we used for marijuana cultivation, it was other food crops grown under cover, and floricultural production for marijuana processing and product manufacturing. We used spice and extract manufacturing. For wholesale distribution, we used tobacco product and electronic cigarette merchant wholesalers. For marijuana retail stores, we used tobacco, electronic cigarette, and other smoking supplies retailers and other miscellaneous retailers. So that was the comparables that we used.
Yep, yep.
Revenue cutoffs were utilized based on revenue determinations. Um, oh, and an upper limit of 15 million in annual revenue, unless there was less. So I'd have to look into individually in each one of them. I don't think we include
I'm
that
just asking
in the
ballpark. We're
footnote.
not going to cite you on this, Andrew. This is candid
It was a few
conversation.
million. It was a few million. Yeah. So a small business. I think the smallest one is like floriculture for it to become like a no longer a small business. And I think that was like a 2.5 or 3 million
But even if the
in that.
ceiling's 15 million, it's like it's an interesting data point to extrapolate from where it's like, all right, if you look around, the
Yeah.
majority of cannabis businesses that you know of, like top line revenue is probably less than 15 million, which is still a
The
great
vast
small
majority.
business. Like
Yeah.
that's, but it's
And,
it's just
and
a different
the
business.
one for the number of employees, all of them were below um, that we
Okay.
looked at. And so that's why we used the 15 cap out. Because we wanted to differentiate, some of these businesses on the wholesale side were bigger sort of thing. Um, So yeah, that's kind of how we looked at that. And so the first part of your question, Ray, was on um, kind of some of the structure of the market. You wouldn't mind trailing back. I know there's a two-part question. I kind of answered the second half, but I want to make sure to
Yeah,
answer the
just
first.
honestly, I don't really recall exactly where I was going with it, but it was just like the I'll just move on to the next one. Kind of like so the economics of some of these businesses that you've seen, kind of like where does the business change over time? Like as like when you look at a business, like how would you say the businesses go? And I'm just thinking through the lens of like we think through the businesses as four phases. because they kind of require different accounting and finance along the
Yeah.
way. It's like pre-revenue, then they go to post-revenue, revenues kick on, then they hit
Yeah.
profitability and scalability. But how do you think through the life cycle of some of these cannabis businesses? Because we are a startup industry, and so everybody's got that goal of startup to exit, startup to sells. But how do
Yeah.
you think through these different phases of the businesses?
It's funny you said that. I gave a talk last week as part of our so Colorado has this access to experts program, which is pretty cool. The state will essentially foot the bill for qualified social equity licensees or applicants to work with experts. So my services are pitch decks. I help people do the econ and design pitch decks and stuff like that. So I gave a talk as part of that program, and I broke it down into three phases. So I'm really looking at it from the startups, but essentially, and it was really kind of understanding your cost structures. So, pre-operational capital expenditures and pre-operational initial hiring, and some both hard and soft costs. Then second phase is kind of that, post-revenue, both pre and post-revenue. But there you are trying to understand what your metrics are. So this is the learning phase, right? There's the pre-opening phase, there's the learning phase. And with that learning phase, you're making a lot of mistakes. And you are, maybe there's some hiring problems, some new teams, you get all of that solidified. How long does that learning phase takes depends on whether or not you're a new entrepreneur, how turbulent the market is, luck, things like that. And, maybe it's 6, 8, 12, 18, 24 months, maybe even longer than that. And once you get out of the, where are you at when you get from one stage to the other? I don't even necessarily it's profitability is this third stage because a lot of cannabis companies, even the biggest ones, aren't profitable.
Yeah,
In my mind, when you get from the second to the third stage is when you have predictable metrics, when you can look at your business growth and your costs and your staffing, and you can make accurate projections into the future. Because once you can make accurate projections into the future, you can plan and understand what changes you need to make in your business to become profitable.
I 100% agree. You are speaking my language.
So that requires, good CPAs, good CFOs, good accounting controller, so that you can actually understand that data. Because if you are not collecting good data during your learning phase, you're not learning,
Yeah,
or at
yeah, we
least
gotta.
you don't have the ability to retrospectively assess your success and learn from it, right? Like, you know, it as an entrepreneur, you can't run everything off of your own mind, right? It's just not possible. And
Yeah, for sure.
so you definitely can't pay taxes that way,
No, you
or
can
get
get far with it. You
audited.
can sell weed. You can get it there. You can get it to
Yeah,
market. You can do a lot of things in your head, but like you get to a certain scale where it's like the human brain can only compute so much.
you gotta have a team. And so,
Yeah.
in order to really use data analysis, you have to collect data, right? And data analysis is the name of the game in terms of understanding from that phase, phase two to phase three. When, in phase three, you're profitable, you're running, maybe you are looking at your next venture, you're hiring a COO or a manager to come in and assist, kind of keeping the wheels on track. But you know where you're going and you know what to expect, right? Yes, you might hit certain turbulence here and there, but you've seen it before and you understand what that looks like. And that's kind of where I look at it from that third phase. Now, once you reach profitability, maybe there's a fourth stage in which you're exiting. But really, like in my mind, when you are a entrepreneur in one state and you're looking to open another venture in another state, that's just a new venture. Now you're in phase one and phase two into phase three. So it's kind of that
Mhm.
leapfrog dynamic. I look at it in three phases. Ray, what's your fourth stage? Because you said you look at it in four stages, where I was
It's
just looking at
pre-revenue,
three.
post-revenue, profitability, and then scaling. And to your
Yeah,
point, we think through profitability the same way as you is it's not a getting there. Like the only way to get there is to start closing your books each month, actually get the data that you can measure. Because like once you can't improve anything until you measure it, because you need a
yeah,
baseline. And like our baselines are budgets. And like
yeah,
just getting these cannabis companies to operate from a really solid baseline budget each month and then close the books, compare budgets to actuals, do a forecast of the next month. You already have like the annual one, but then breaking it down. And then scalability, once you actually, to your point, have measurable metrics. And the profits could be $1. It just needs to be positive profits. But once you hit profitability, then you switch to the next phase, which is all right, now we can scale this, which is kind of brings me to valuations and talking to sources of capital because you either have built a cash reserves, which would be awesome, and then you can just use that cash as capital to expand. But normally it's not how it works. We need to raise capital. And we just think of it as capital management because, like, outside of
Yeah.
cannabis, that's how normal business is done. It's not like the founders are always putting up their money to expand their business.
Yeah.
They go to their
Yeah.
banking relationship or their lender relationship. And so
Yeah.
that's kind of our fourth phase is scaling. And that's going to, again, it's like, okay, now we need a little bit more of these very high level CFO services to talk to sources of capital, do that analysis. It's called like an A/B analysis, like play the numbers out, which I know you're really good at. And so, kind of when a company does get a little bit to that third phase and they're looking to either expand to a new market, whether they're taking on capital to expand or they do want to exit. But at some point, they're going to need a valuation. And it doesn't even need to be an exit, to be honest. Like there's a number of reasons a company wants a very formal valuation, or even less than that, like a good
Yeah.
financial
Informal.
model. So, can you talk through just your experience with valuations and financial modeling, and where do the economists fit in with the certified valuation analysts and kind of
Yeah.
conversation? I know I threw a lot at you, but tell
No,
me a bit about
absolutely. It's
valuation.
a good, great question. So, I would say there's this. There's a lot of different purposes for evaluation.
Yeah.
But the first thing you need to think about when you're looking at evaluation is this evaluation for contract purposes? So, you need a real solid valuation because someone is buying a certain amount of equity in your business.
Mm-hmm.
And if things go wrong because the valuation was off, there's litigation, right? Is there litigation risk associated with the valuation? And in that case, you want to certify, you want to spend more money on your valuation. You want a certified valuation expert. You want a market analyst. You want some CPAs. It's like this all needs to be really tight
Yep, and insured.
and insured, right? And that's because, right, if there's something wrong with the valuation, you don't want to get sued, right?
Yep,
Then
yep,
there's different types of valuations. Then there's valuations for the purposes of starting a negotiation, right?
yeah.
You
So
want to know, hey, what should I list my cannabis company for? And how should I engage in that, arm's length transaction, um,
mm-hmm.
about selling it, right? In most of those cases, right, if you're just trying to buy an asset or sell an asset, like you don't, the value is what you're willing to pay or what someone else is willing to pay for it. What you want to have is, okay, a ballpark, right? And so a lot of those ballpark analyses are just, either a market structure where you're just looking at, okay, market-based valuations. So you're looking at how other cannabis companies have sold within that market or similar markets. You're doing, a comparison of, okay, well, this market is similar to that. And, it's a lot more, particularly for pre-operational companies, it's a lot more of, educated guesswork and pulling in assumptions, credible assumptions and techniques from different sorts of states. So it's like, I did something in, a evaluation for a pre-operational. It was not even that. It was just like hey, this is kind of what I want to do, and I want to open up a cannabis store on this border area of Minnesota. And I'm looking to attract investors. Like, what should I start out as, right? Like, what the value of the company is at that stage, right? It's all pre-operational, and it's really just what someone is
Kind of
willing to
like what
give
are the
you
drivers? Mainly like they're trying to learn like what drives revenue, what drives expenses or costs, how
yeah.
expensive is the capex going to be in this, the fair market value of this region or this
I mean,
state.
in a lot of cases, they're just trying to look at what the revenue might be,
Yeah, that's right. Let's
right?
just
What the
start there.
revenue
Keep business
generation,
simple. How much
right?
money can
Because
this thing make?
if you are looking at a pre-operational company and you're investing in that pre-operational company to the point that you would have a say over how it gets operated, your cost structures are completely unknown, right? Because they're also very different, right? Like if you open up a small little retail store with three kiosks or two kiosks staffed by five people, it's very different than operating something with 12 kiosks in a city, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like the extent of what you want to build is going to change your cost structures. The main thing people want to know is, what does the demand look like in this small area? And that's kind of where bringing in a market analyst is very helpful because, I can look at other states and look at other places and say, evaluate, okay, these are the number of consumers in your area based upon existing data that, is out there. And, how many of them are likely to come. So that's really what I think helps a lot of people. Um,
Okay.
is these that's a lot of the valuation work I do is pre-operational.
That makes
Um,
sense. It's more the market analysts of like, all right, what can this market actually produce? How educated are the buyers? How, what are their
yeah,
demographics? Okay, that makes a ton of
I
sense
mean,
because yeah,
you
you got
still
it.
need a market estimate in order to do like a discounted cash flow analysis, right?
Like the
Because you
business
have to project
model.
forward what your cash flows are going to be and then discount that back to determine the, net present value of your company. But that's going to be easier to do a projection because you can do it really based upon your past history and your metrics, where you don't necessarily to the same extent need a economist who can tell you what does this market actually look like because you are operating in that market. You know what it looks like because you know what your sales have looked like. So that's kind of it's a little bit of the differences in methodology
Right.
when
It
I
lends
get
itself to
pulled
people
in.
getting into new ones.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So
So
most of what I do is pre-operational, which I looking to jump more into the post-operational valuation work, which I've done. But it's gonna be interesting because that sort of work is often where, let's say someone is exiting or someone is entering, that's where the litigation risk of having a misplaced valuation can be off because then someone feels like they got hosed. And depending on what your operating agreement looks like,
yeah.
you may have a situation in which that can get contentious.
And that makes sense if it's post revenue for sure. And that's why there's the CVA license, three ways to do it, fair market value, cash flow discount. Okay.
Yeah,
Um,
well, there's a lot of different ways you can do. I mean, within each of the large three segments of analyses, there's a bunch of smaller different ways. Not all of them are really applicable to the
but it
cannabis
makes
space.
sense. Different businesses, different
Yeah,
valuations based
yeah.
on IP might be important in this industry and IP is not important in this industry, stuff like that.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, what is it like, if you look at big cannabis companies, it'd be like what percentage of it is goodwill and intangibles? Um, right? So many of the Canadian cannabis companies when they were trading at billions of dollars and then they suddenly drop a lot. It's like, wait, what happened? And it'd be like, well, it was actually like hundreds of millions of dollars worth of quote unquote goodwill and intangibles, and maybe that goodwill wasn't as strong as you thought it was.
right? It's like ghost assets. Um, no, that so with that in mind, kind of thinking through kind of new market and just market analysis. So a bit of a bummer this year. Florida didn't pass, the Dakotas didn't pass their adult use, but realistically, I saw kind of from what I heard, I don't think it's that big of a deal. It's definitely like set the overall cannabis industry back, but as far as like I don't know those small to medium sized businesses that we were talking about, which is like who I serve, kind of helped us out. But that was a bit of a bummer though overall. But like kind of your thoughts market analysis, what markets are you excited about looking forward into 2025 and beyond, and not even just within the United States, but just other markets in other countries?
Yeah. I mean, so definitely still the United States, right?
Yeah, that's
If you asked
easy.
me that question like 3 or 4 years ago, I'd be like, dude, Germany might pop off. Like, this is really interesting. 2, 3 years ago, seems like it's not gonna pop off. And if Germany's not really gonna open up a large commercial market, it's gonna set back most of Western Europe a while because most of them are looking to Germany to move forward. The
Yeah,
Canadian market had its boom and bust, and so I'd have to analyze, I have it in a bit where it's at right now. Um, but it's in a different stage than it was, a handful of years ago.
yeah. All right,
Let's
let's
talk
keep with the
about,
United States. What's got you
yeah, let's
interested
talk
in
about the United
that?
States. Um, so where growth is going to occur, right? I'm interested to see when and how Michigan reaches its plateau, right? It was growing for a long period of time. I'd have to analyze some of the more recent data over the summer to see where that growth trajectory has changed. Be a lot of growth in Ohio, right? They opened up their adult use stores just this past summer. It's a pretty big market, got a lot of major cities. It's got a good number of existing licensees, so that should be interesting. Similar thing in Missouri, they're still a growing state comes to adult use. Really fascinating to see what happens in Minnesota. They're going to be delayed a little bit with the way the lottery system is rolling out. But that's kind of the first state where they've got a really strong commercialized intoxicating, cannabinoid hemp program,
Yep.
with a lot of major beverage brands coming out of Minnesota, and they are now integrating in an adult use market on top of that. So that's to be really interesting.
Yeah, yeah.
Think Maryland still's got some room to grow. They've got relatively high prices in Maryland, but we're seeing new licensees come about. So there's that. Also New York and New Jersey. New York obviously was really slow to start. New Jersey a little less so. But definitely growth in that area, tri-state area generally. Connecticut as well. Um, so there's that. I mean, then it's like what's happening with the California market, right? The California market, small
Yeah,
little
what
swings from a percentage basis are hundreds of millions, if not $1 billion in California. And so what happens with that market? Obviously, there's a lot of market turbulence over the last 2 years or so with some of the major distributors going under, a lot of
yeah.
payment issues throughout the supply chain for cannabis businesses in California. So, does that get straightened out over time? Where do we see cannabis businesses falling out? Colorado, we're still seeing cannabis businesses, go under. And what is the stable point for us, in which the market kind of recorrects? I thought it was going to happen a couple months ago, but it still quite hasn't. So that's kind of interesting. Um, Kind of other markets for growth. I mean, Florida finally stopped growing on its number of patients with like over 840,000 or so patients.
That's a good
It's a
number.
lot. It's a lot. So, I mean, they didn't go adult use. They still have the largest medical cannabis market in the country by far. I think they still probably have um the third or fourth largest cannabis market, in the country. Um, and
Looking
so,
at BDSA right now. Shout out to them. Yeah, 2.6 or 2.7 million in medical sales forecasted for 2024,
a
which is
billion, yeah.
in medical only. Like that does blow my mind to just be over almost 3 billion in medical. Because again, like it's just like when these states flip from medical to adult use, which is why we like Ohio, we like Minnesota, we opened up two offices, in those states respectively. It's like a 3 to 5x in revenue. It's like there's a
Depends
good.
though. Depends though,
Okay. What
right?
is Yeah, you're the economist. Keep me honest. What do you see when
So
they switch from medical to adult use as far as
it's
increase in
all about
sales?
the growth of the medical system, right? And so how, quasi-adult use is the medical system, right? Anyone who
Yeah, yeah.
thought that Oklahoma going adult use would triple in size doesn't understand what its existing infrastructure, who existing infrastructures were serving, right?
Mm-hmm.
So with 840, we're still likely to see some significant growth, particularly when it comes to tourism, right? There's a lot more tourism in Florida than there is in Oklahoma. Although I haven't been there in a while, but Oklahoma's a cool state. Um,
I like Oklahoma City. I was there one time. Really
yeah,
enjoyed
I
the
hear, I hear
scenery.
Tulsa's pretty sweet too. Um, so, if we're looking at like, okay, well, what is that going to trend towards? We really have to look at where that growth of that market. So, Ohio had a pretty small medical market, so they could see a 4, 5x. Um, you
I
know,
would say they didn't have I would say like a 500 million in medical sales. Like that's a pretty decent
no,
market.
to per capita is
Oh,
small.
okay.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah. Um, yeah, it was significantly underperforming per capita. Um,
It's because they're in Midwest. They're just nice people
Now,
hanging out.
it had more to do with the prices, some
Yep, yep.
limitations on certain potency
Michigan's
of
right there. They can
products, a
stock
lot of
up
other
while they're
stuff.
there.
Yeah. If we're looking at like, growth though, so it's like, for instance, like New Jersey, they had a relatively small medical program. Um, Significant bump up when it comes to adult use. Same thing with New York, right? New York's adult use program isn't really thriving yet, but New York, like, in their medical program, never, was never higher than 200 million, which is tiny
Wow.
for the state of New York. Um, and even with their anemic adult use program in, 2023, it was like 100 over 150 million in sales. Um, so, if we look at like, and then it also depends upon the state, like Nevada. Um, right? Their medical program was okay per capita, but like it's a huge tourist area. So adding adult use is going to be a big bump there.
Yeah, yeah, with Vegas, it's just like a way bigger return going adult use there. And
Yeah.
then, oh, all right, I'm seeing we're getting pushed up on time here, so I want to bring
Yeah.
this into land because honestly, like I could nerd out on this stuff with you a while, Andrew. I got my little map out now. I'm looking at it and like seeing the tweaks for medical because there is so many factors, and so like with so many levers in the industry, it's you got to look at it fairly holistically. So that's why I really appreciate your just economic take on it because it's a startup industry. It's coming out of prohibition. It's exciting. So there's just a lot of like hype around it, emotional, hot takes on
Yeah.
the industry. And so I just like using the numbers. And so really appreciate kind of your breakdown. And like you said, there's a lot of areas that are growing, whether they legalize for adult use or they just grow the medical program or they grow their current adult use program. The industry is growing. And so I think, I feel very fortunate to be a part of it. I know you feel very fortunate to be a part of it. And so just really appreciate your time and just let everybody know kind of where can they find you? What's the easiest way to get in touch if they would, if you are taking appearances in 2025, what do you got going on?
Yeah. So I'll definitely be speaking at a few different things. Not sure exactly what yet for 2025, but you can email me. I'm just a.livingston at VicenteLLP.com. You can find me on LinkedIn. I don't respond there as much. You can reach out to our offices in Denver. Give us a call. Let them know that you want to set up a potential new client call with Andrew. And I'm always happy to usually they're booked for 15 minutes. You'll get 30. I'll open up spreadsheets. We'll nerd out about a whole bunch of different stuff. And then, if you're interested in engaging, we'll help you grow your business.
Awesome, awesome. And yeah, as we just said, everybody sometimes people think the cannabis industry has already happened in the United States and all of us in it know it's like nope, it's like still very much just getting started. And so yeah, so anybody
Oh
who
yeah. It's
or
gonna be
new,
a 50-year period
yeah.
until it is like a fully national boring market, right? If we started out we're now almost 30 years in from Proposition 215 in California, right? November 2025, next year, we will be at 30 years since the first medical program started. And it's not like uh it was no, was that 1996? Yeah, it was 96. So sorry, 2 more years, and it will be 30 years from now. And then, from that period of time, right, there were laws passed in 2000, in 1998, laws passed in 2000, so it is a trickle and a constant movement, right? Not all states in the country even have medical cannabis, right? Like,
Say I'm one of them. I live in Wisconsin. It's hilarious.
yeah, I mean, like, I would say, what is up with Wisconsin? But I know what's up with Wisconsin, which is Republicans took over a crazy amount of gerrymandering in over the last decade, and your state legislature is no longer representative at all of the actual population's desires. But you also knew that. Um,
It is what it is. I
the
kind of
larger
just,
politics dynamic, right? All it takes is, a Democratic trifecta, and then you'll be Minnesota. So we'll see.
hey, that's kind of what I'm shooting for. And so I've got my eye on the pulse here, but I'm also, serving the legal markets outside of
Yeah.
it. And so, yeah, hopefully we can have another conversation about Wisconsin soon.
I
But
mean,
again,
or we just say all cannabis is cannabinoid hemp. And then we all just get
kind of
to
where we're at.
just, drink cannabis beers, even if they're produced from low THC cannabis.
So we could have a whole episode. Our next one could be hemp bevs. Cause like I was at the bar, like I'm in Wisconsin, very similar to Minnesota. Like hemp beverages has been a thing for years, like it's
Yeah,
very
yeah.
common where
It's
so now
wild.
it's becoming a major hot topic and I get it. So we can't get into it on this one, Andrew. We'll save that one
All
for
right,
another
we'll do
day.
another.
That's a growing
Thanks.
skew as well. All right.
Thank you so
Talk to you
much,
later.
Ray. Thank you,
Yep.
everyone.
Bye bye.